Good morning if you're watching from Canada. Good afternoon if you're here in Belgium. I'm Thomas Daigle. We're coming to you from Tyne Cot Cemetery here in Zonnebeke, Belgium, just near Passchendaele, where 100 years ago today, the Canadian Corps claimed victory. That very muddy, very bloody battle that claimed the lives of more than 4,000 Canadians. In all, 16,000 Canadian troops were either killed or wounded. Very, very bloody battle. Muddy, as I mentioned, that is one of the lasting images of the Battle of Passchendaele. We've seen some rain here today. It's been fairly cold. Not a bad representation of what it must have been like 100 years ago, but it is still so impossible, really, to imagine the conditions, the mud, the blood, the rain, the gunfire, the explosions all around, all that happening right here 100 years ago. That battle ending November 10th, 1917. We're coming to you on the CBC News Facebook page. We're live here. We're going to be taking your questions as best I can. I've been here the past couple days taking in the commemorations around the 100th anniversary of the end of the Battle of Passchendaele. And we're going to be walking around here, Tyne Cot Cemetery, giving you a sense of the huge nature, just how big this is and how important it is for Canadian history, British history, and the history of the Commonwealth in general. Just to give you a sense, there are 12,000 soldiers from the Commonwealth, what was then known as the British Empire, from the First World War, all buried here. There is no Commonwealth grave site bigger in terms of number of burials. No other place has 12,000 or more like they do here at Tyne Cot in Belgium. What's interesting is upwards of 8,000 of those, the vast majority, are actually unidentified. You walk all through these rows of gravestones, and they're often marked a soldier in the Great War. That's, of course, what they called it at the time, the Great War, the war to end all wars. Of course, it was certainly not the last war, but we're actually in a position here where we can show you a number of Canadian graves, and these men who died, as you can see there, 1917, they were identified. This one, Private J.F. Boutillier from the 25th Canadian Infantry there, died 7th of November 1917. Warrant Officer Reese here, only 19 years old, died on the 7th of September 1917. Townsend here from the 85th Battalion, the Canadian Infantry, died October 30th, 1917, only 23. You notice those young ages, 19, 23. Some who signed up here probably weren't supposed to, but they signed up 16 or even just 14. I was speaking to a gentleman who was here, who came over from Toronto a couple days ago to take in the commemorations. His great uncle fought here, and he was just 14. His name is inscribed at the Menin Gate, not too far from here, along with many other war dead, except it's misspelled. He was 14 when he signed up in the Army and didn't want to cause any trouble, so his name ended up misspelled. That might be the case here. I don't know that for a fact, but like I say, many of the soldiers buried here unidentified. Some do have their names on the graves. We're taking your questions on Facebook, and I have a first question here from Howard Mackey Geldart. Asks, how many fallen are there in total? Right here at Tyne Cot Cemetery, there are approximately 12,000, all from the Commonwealth, what was known then as the British Empire in the First World War, and like I said, the majority are unidentified, upwards of 8,000. And it really says a lot about how soldiers were treated, how they were viewed at the time, really as pawns in the Great War. You may have heard about this in history class, you may have heard about this growing up. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force at the time, Sir Douglas Haig, ordered the Canadian Corps here to Passchendaele to claim victory. He was warned that it was going to be bloody, it was going to be brutal, and the casualties would be massive, and indeed they were. The Canadians did claim victory November 10th, 1917, but by the end of it, 16,000 Canadians had been killed or wounded. And that is really what is so closely linked to the memory of the Battle of Passchendaele. It is how bloody and brutal it was. Upwards of 475,000 on both sides of the war killed or wounded here at Passchendaele for what ended up to be, at least in the memory of many Canadians in history classes and whatnot, really sort of pales in comparison in the general memory of people to the battle at Vimy Ridge, not too far from here. Of course, that victory that same year, and Passchendaele often overshadowed by Vimy. Of course, Vimy, very important battle, but this one here especially important, as you can imagine, for the families of those who fought and died here. And we've met a number of them here over the past couple of days who've come over to commemorate the 100th anniversary. You walk through these graves, you see more Canadians here from the 18th Battalion, Canadian Infantry, but here are some from the East Lancashire Regiment, so those would have been British. There are also Australians, New Zealanders, all throughout the Commonwealth, all buried here, 12,000 in general. Want to take more questions on Facebook here. John Blake has a comment. I remember cycling from Tyne Cot to Crest Farm in Passchendaele with my wife. Maybe it took 10 minutes. The street now is named Canada Land. Indeed it is, and you bring up a good point, John. Canada Land, which means Canada Lane. I was there yesterday in Passchendaele, just a few minutes drive from here, and driving up and down, you notice the Canadian flags. People so proud here and thankful for the Canadian contribution to the war 100 years ago. In many cases, those people with the Canadian flags outside, they don't have any other connection to Canada other than the Canadians were here, claimed victory at Passchendaele 100 years ago, and people still, the locals here in Flanders, are so thankful. I want to draw your attention to this cross, and we might have to sort of walk around to get a better view of it, but it is central to the design here at Tyne Cot Cemetery, central to the image of Tyne Cot Cemetery. It is King George V who ordered this memorial cross to be placed right here when he visited Tyne Cot Cemetery back in 1922. It's important because it was installed initially on what was a German pillbox. Those were dugouts that were essentially made of stone that the Canadians and the Commonwealth, the British Empire soldiers came in and took over back in 1917. Oh, see, actually it's written here. This was the Tyne Cot blockhouse captured by the 3rd Australian Division, 4th of October 1917. So, of course, Australia, another important part of the Commonwealth, and that is how that cross ordered by King George V ended up right here, a central part of Tyne Cot Cemetery. Kara Osborne asks, why was Passchendaele important in the greater scheme of the war? Well, historians will say that the British Expeditionary Force, Sir Douglas Haig, the Commander-in-Chief, saw it as a step that had to be taken. We, had to go and take Passchendaele, no matter how many lives that would take, and that's what happened. I would share with you, looking back, a quote from Winston Churchill. I don't want to misquote him, so I'll bring up the exact quote here, but how at the time it was seen as an important objective in the war, but Winston Churchill later said, the Battle of Passchendaele was a forlorn expenditure of valor and life without equal in futility. A great exercise in futility. That's how a lot of people look back at Passchendaele given that it was such, well, a bloodbath. And you might be able to see in the distance there people visiting Tyne Cot. We've seen folks from, heard some Australian and New Zealand accents for sure, and British people. We've run into some Canadians who are taking part in commemorations for the centennial from the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, but you get the sense that people are here visiting this tremendous, tremendous burial ground every day. Busloads every day. Okay, going to take some more questions on Facebook. Ayaz Ahmed asks, in which city is that graveyard? So we are in Zonnebeke. My Flemish isn't great, but I believe that's the approximate pronunciation here in Belgium. Passchendaele is now, as far as I understand, is actually sort of a district, a village within Zonnebeke. Passchendaele itself, sort of just down the road from here. But when you hear about Flanders Fields that John McCrae wrote about, that's here. This is where that fighting occurred. You can see just how deep those fields go here in Flanders, and this is quite literally where the poppies grow. The poppies, of course, that went on to become a tremendous symbol on Remembrance Day for Canadians and people over in Britain as well. Howard Mackey Geldart comments that these kids were only 19 years old. Indeed, 19 or younger in some cases, signing up for war. Oh, here. So I'm not mistaken in saying this is a poppy, correct? Many left here in memory of the soldiers. This one in memory of, I assume that's a British Royal Field Artillery, a British soldier. Comments and questions on Facebook. We're live here from Tyne Cot Cemetery. Thank you for those who've already commented and asked questions. Going to take another couple more here. Nicole Wood comments, I was there in 1998 for the 80th anniversary of the war. The ceremony at Meningate was beautiful and attended by the Queen, Belgian royals and all surviving veterans across the Commonwealth. I can tell you I was at Meningate, what was it now, Wednesday night. What's amazing about Meningate, which again is not too far from here, it is this huge, sprawling war memorial where there are thousands of names of war dead inscribed in the walls, but someone plays the bugle there every night, 8 o'clock, and plays the last post every single night, almost nonstop, almost every night since 1928, if you can imagine. It was very special this week, the last post ceremony on Wednesday, attended by Canadian Forces members, in memory, of course, of the Canadian contribution, the Canadian lives lost here 100 years ago. Again, just to give you a sense of the size of this place, it's really breathtaking. 12,000 Commonwealth war dead buried here at Tyne Cot Cemetery in Belgium, and so many of them, upwards of 8,000 unnamed, unidentified. Here's a New Zealander. I see another Canadian there, a Canadian sergeant of the Great War. Again, not named, definitely a male, probably a young man who died here and wasn't repatriated. They didn't repatriate the bodies back then. They just left them here and sometimes left them unidentified. Just going to have a look at some of the questions we're getting on Facebook as we keep walking around here, Tyne Cot Cemetery. Just going to tell my colleague Pascal to watch for that tree just behind him there, where he's sort of walking backwards unprotected there. So it's a very peaceful place, but you got to watch out for the trees. Scott Hoyt asks, I wonder, did fighting happen near these graves during the Second World War? Were they protected? That's a very good question. I don't necessarily know the answer. My colleague Cheryl in Toronto at the desk might be able to look that up. I mean, they certainly look untouched from burial during the, after the First World War. I should mention, I was talking about Meningate a minute ago, about the ceremony, the last post being played there every night, almost every night since 1928. Only a few nights during the Second World War, during the German invasion, the Nazis were there, of course. Only a few nights did they actually stop that ceremony. It largely went on non-stop during the Second World War, amazingly. Faye Marie Dombrowski asks, or comments, there are also many soldiers whose bodies were never recovered due to their mud. Their names are listed on a wall there. My great uncle James Kenny is listed there. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Faye. There is indeed a wall over here with thousands of names here, and as well as at Meningate. So many memorials and grave sites of Canadians and Commonwealth soldiers around here and in this region of Belgium, and indeed many of them listed on a wall, and that in many cases is the only sort of lasting memory of them, just their name on a wall. Kevin Bourgeois comments, many people think of the Second World War when it comes to Remembrance Day and much less focus on the First World War. Well, yeah, I'm glad we're here. Thank you for your comment, Kevin. I am glad we're here and able to showcase this. I was talking about this earlier, but it's worth noting how when it comes to the First World War, Canadians will often think of the victory at Vimy Ridge 100 years ago. Just a few months ago, we commemorated 100 years at Vimy Ridge. This was remembered, perhaps you'll recall, in a movie a few years ago. That's what actually brought this to the attention of a lot of Canadians. The name Passchendaele, of course, the name of that movie a few years ago. Jessica King, a comment from Jessica King, I visited this location to pay my respects in 2004 while backpacking in Europe. Many locals there still holding Canadians in high regard due to the Canadian contribution and sacrifices in the First World War. And that bears repeating. The number of Canadian flags I've seen here over the past couple days, really amazing. People hold Canadians to a high regard here and still say thank you all these, a century later, for the Canadian contribution and all that was done. I want to, if we can, swing around over here. I have sort of a piece of Canadian history to share with you, if I can find it again. I think it's over here. There's so many stones, of course, and they all look very similar when you're walking through, unless you're looking for one in particular. And try to find it here and share this part of the story with you. No, I think I'm in the wrong row. Pascal, my cameraman, I think we're one row over. So let's just go over here, and maybe it's one or two. It's going to be worth the wait once we find this, but we're just looking for one grave in particular of a Canadian war hero here. We'll find him, and we will bring it to you. There are just so many of them. Like I was saying, 12,000 graves, and a lot of them look very similar. A lot of them are unnamed, unidentified, and when you're looking for one in particular, if you've sort of lost your way, it's easy to get lost. I'm being told it's likely over here. Oh, I see it. I see what we're looking for. Sorry about that. There's a Canadian flag, Canadian poppy. That's for Lance Corporal W.R. Woods from the 27th Canadian Infantry there. 6th November 1917 is when he died. Yeah, again, age 19, if you can imagine, coming over here, not knowing what to expect, coming over, obviously overseas for the first time in their lives, and finding the end of their lives. So here's the monument, or the grave I wanted to show you. Took a bit of time to get here, but here it is. And this is Private James Peter Robertson, who died on the 6th of November 1917. Now, he was 35, and I want to draw your attention just to this right here, VC, Victoria Cross, and that is the highest honor for a soldier serving. You'll recall at the time Canada was part of the British Empire, and that is the highest honor for valor in the face of the enemy. So Private James Peter Robertson, Canadian, honored with the Victoria Cross, and you see his grave really stands out here, people leaving poppies and messages saying his sacrifice will never be forgotten. So his story, in a nutshell, he was born in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, later lived in Medicine Hat, Alberta, but just to give you a sense, on the final assault on Passchendaele, November 6, 1917, with his battalion, he was able to head into the gunfire from the Germans, kill, I believe it was 4 Germans, and then take their gun, turn their gun on them. Took the German machine gun, fired at the Germans. how he managed to do that is unbeknownst to me, but not only did he do that, but then two Canadian snipers were in the line of fire. They were down. He managed to run into the line of fire, pick one up, move him out of harm's way. A second time, again, runs into the line of fire, picks up a second comrade, and that is when he's hit by a shell from enemy fire. And that is how James Peter Robertson died here, age 35, right here at Passchendaele, and later honored with the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for valor, part of the British Empire. So quite a story. Some would certainly regard him as a Canadian war hero. Going to keep walking here a little bit and perhaps take more questions on Facebook. Should we just go over here? And just check these questions on Facebook. We're live, by the way, on CBC News Facebook from Tyne Cot Cemetery here in Zonebeke, Belgium. The shadows are long, says Dave Jacobs. Indeed, it's 3:58 p.m. Here in Belgium, and you can see the sun is just beginning to set. And when you say the shadows are long, of course, there can be many implications there, but it is really a heavy place to be when you consider 12,000 Commonwealth soldiers who fought for freedom, many of them just teenagers 100 years ago, and they're buried here. More Commonwealth war graves here than anywhere else in the world. We're going to start to draw down the Facebook Live here. Just going to maybe show you a couple more Canadian graves. If we can find another few. Here's one, and this bears repeating. We talked about this earlier, but it bears repeating that among the 12,000 buried here, so many are unidentified, upwards of 8,000, including this one. We know that he was a Canadian soldier of the Great War. That is how he's identified, and simply identified as being known unto God. And there's the maple leaf and a poppy left in his memory. And next to him, buried another soldier, could be a Canadian, could be a Brit or an Australian. He's simply unidentified, and that is the case for so many soldiers here. Of course, their bodies weren't repatriated. They were just left here to die. Amanda Lee asks a personal question: what's my favorite part of the cemetery? I think it is the fact that you are brought. You build this. How do I say this? This personal connection to the men who fought here. You know, we hear about the First World War. It was such a long time ago. When we think about Remembrance Day, oftentimes we talk a lot more about the Second World War. So for so many, we're 3 or 4 generations removed from what happened here, the people who fought here. And so coming here, reading the names, seeing that these were men, in many cases just boys, that they fought and died here and they're buried right here, it really sort of brings it home. And with the rain earlier today, it was very cold, it just gives you a sense of how miserable it must have been with that never-ending rain, just the mud and the mess, and of course the tremendous bloodshed. It's just impossible to imagine, but it gives you a little sense of what it could have been like. Just hell on earth, really. That's what so many people call it. Rob McGuire says he visited Tyne Cot back in June 2015. Very difficult to grasp, he says, the concept of so many buried and remembered in such a small, contained area. The cross of sacrifice here was placed on top of the remains of a German pillbox that dominated the area. And maybe Pascal we can show that cross of sacrifice that we were talking about a little earlier, but it bears repeating that was, I believe, King George V who ordered that cross of sacrifice to be placed there on top of the German pillbox, what was essentially a dugout that the Germans used. I believe that one was taken by Australian forces back in 1917. You see the crowd starting to to crowd into, to walk into Tyne Cot Cemetery here. I think there must have been a busload of tourists that just arrived, but that's the sense you get. You get a real connection, a real feeling that these men were here, they fought here, they died here, and it really hits home, especially for a Canadian like me, so far from home. I want to thank you for watching. I think we're going to wind down this Facebook Live now. We've been live here at Tyne Cot Cemetery. Of course, our coverage online on CBC Radio, CBC Television, and News Network will continue, of course, here from Passchendaele today, but of course tomorrow as well. Plenty of coverage from Ottawa and beyond for the Remembrance Day commemorations. Lest we forget, as they say. Thanks for watching.